the questions should be the questions should be in the Q&A section. So please write them as Lev speaks in the Q&A section of the Zoom below, and then we'll have a question and answer section after Lev's talk. So I hope that's okay with everybody who is in here. And now, without much further ado, I will give the floor to Lev Manovich.
Thank you very much. I mean, how do you like in the West? How do you pronounce your name? Daniil or Daniel or?
I don't even hear the difference, Daniil.
Okay, because in Russian, right? My proper pronunciation of my last name is Manovich, but when I came to America 43 years ago, I learned it has to be Manovich.
It's like the usual Chomsky dichotomy.
I guess so. Yes. Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted there are so many people here, and hoping we'll have some interesting questions at the end. So I realized that there are some people who kind of know my work, and if I show some of my kind of classical data visualization from 15 years ago, they may be bored, but there's probably also a new generation of graduate students or young researchers, who haven't seen it. It's always right, like it's the same thing when you're teaching. You can't please everybody. So I will try to do a bit of everything, right? I will first, very briefly, right, present my own kind of subjective, idiosyncratic vision of cultural analytics, which is, let's say, different from how many people use it, because today we have Journal of Cultural Analytics. There are many graduate programs or certificate programs which also use this term, and every program, every publication, every person uses it differently. And I'm not definitely here to police the term, right? I'm not here to impose my idea. So I simply want to give you my own personal vision, and then kind of briefly summarize not all, but a few key ideas from my book, published in 2020 by MIT Press, which, by the way, my assistant keep putting the free PDF of a book on my website, and I keep telling her to take it off, but she didn't. So you can download it for like 2 years, okay? Okay, it's just she's terrible, what can I say, Okay. And then very briefly again, for those of you who know this, show like few of our projects, and then I want to the new part of the talk, let's say hopefully maybe 50%, is I haven't published it yet, which is my summary of what I see are particularly important challenges for looking at culture, or in particular visual culture or analog culture. So it also applies to dance, kind of music, architecture, and so on, as data. And these challenges, are very serious. In fact, after thinking about them for a few years, and after I published my book, I decided, it's too difficult. So I kind of stopped doing it, and then started to write about the new paradigm of AI, and doing my own kind of personal work. But this is a great opportunity for me to come back to these ideas and with you think about what do we gain, right, by looking at culture as numbers, and what do we lose. Okay. Okay. Go here. All right. So I got the idea for cultural analytics in the fall of 2005. So it's almost 20 years. The lab was originally called Software Studies Lab, and then later it was renamed. And the idea of a lab, which seems to be very obvious, I think, and logical now, but it was not at all obvious in the late 2000s, because this concept of big data didn't really become popular until maybe 2008, 2010. So from the beginning, we kind of had two goals, right? Two sides of the same medal, is to use data science methods to analyze contemporary global culture while critically interrogating these methods from the perspectives of humanities in media theory. Okay? Now, there are many kind of paths which led me to this idea, but I think the key was the opening of a big research institute on the campus of University of California, San Diego, where I was a professor in the Department of Visual Art, teaching digital art since 1996. So in 2005, we kind of opened the new big, 8-story building for the new research institute, aiming to invent the next feature of computing, and also to bring researchers who would come from many different fields, life sciences, medicine, archaeology, can be united by the new emerging paradigm of big data and visualization. Okay? So we opened the institute in 2005 and kind of started going there and realized that this new paradigm is coming, and regardless of your field, right, there's a new kind of workflow, a new way of thinking about something where using different methods, you collect big data, you process this data using techniques of a field which also was just emerging at the time, data science. And then you use kind of visual supercomputers, often, right, as much as possible, large visualization machines to store this data interactively. And so in the summer of 2007, I kind of went, to the opening of a building, this institute, and I saw this big visualization supercomputers. So this was a version from 2009, where we have 70 30-inch monitors, connected to a number of PCs, and I saw kind of scientists exploring interactively, pictures of galaxies, or some 300,000 pixels wide visualization of human brain. And I said, okay. And then 2 months later, I remember I was sitting in my room. It was November 2007, and suddenly this idea came to my head. I said, of course, why not put art? Why not put visual culture on these displays? And the idea, right, the particular image, the particular project idea which came to my head was also very interesting. I was thinking about the origins of art history and the famous work of Henry Wolfram, Principles of Art History, published in 1915, a kind of proto-structuralist work where Wolfram makes a kind of structural opposition on 5 dimensions between the visual form of Renaissance and Baroque. And I said, but humanities and art history also use natural language to describe their objects, right? And natural language describes the world using kind of categories. So in a way, it's very natural that Wolfram, 100 years earlier, kind of pushes the specificity of natural language and comes up with categorical, kind of structural, oppositional idea, right? That there are, 5 characteristics of art and Renaissance, and then, they become 5 opposite characteristics, right, in Baroque. But what if we use large-scale visualization and computer vision, right, as a new meta-language, as a new instrument to look at history of art, or contemporary art, or comics, or cinema, or book covers, or anything you want, and instead of kind of starting with linguistic categories and then fitting our examples to these categories. What if we start with kind of bottom up, right? What if we take a large data set, ideally all paintings in all museums, let's say between 1500 and 1600. And again, things haven't been really digitized yet. Digitization was just getting started. So that was also a leap I made. I said, okay, but in a few years, it will become available just as it is today. And we take all these paintings, right? We take digital images. We use computer vision techniques, and we measure their characteristics, composition, brush strokes, position and presence of faces, figures, colors, and also various characteristics of shapes and forms, which were important to Wolfram. And then we kind of plot, right, these paintings and put them on this display, where on a x-axis you will have time from 1500 to 1600, and on the y-axis you will position paintings according to some kind of summary with characteristics, a kind of dimension, which in a way can be described as a Renaissance to Baroque, and then we'll see how Renaissance became Baroque, right? So if Wolfram, or later people like Foucault, for example, right, were kind of interested in this very discontinuous, right, very categorical, very linguistic idea about history, right? So in Wolfram, Renaissance miraculously become Baroque. Later in Foucault, one episteme is replaced by another episteme, right? I thought, and now this idea, of course, is obvious because people have done it in relation to history of literature in many other fields, but it was not at all obvious in 2007. And it's still not obvious to people in relation to visual arts, right? Instead of looking at culture as a kind of series of historical periods, a series of names, a series of geographic locations, a series of discontinuous objects, we can think about culture in terms of gradual changes. And, in 2007, I got funding, so to do the lab. And then, a couple of years later, you can look at the result with pictures from 2010. So it's one of the visualizations we made of 1 million pages of manga. And the pages are organized according to selected visual characteristics. And we're looking and we're kind of interactively exploring this data set and sorting it in different ways, right? So, so the idea was to take the techniques of interactive large-scale data visualization and apply them to visual culture, but there's also something else, right? But something else is that, so this is the whole visualization, the actual size is 20,000 by 20,000 pixels, and I will show you, how it looks in a close-up. But right now, I just want to convey this idea that what I also realized right away, right, because my background, of course, was in visual art and digital art. I started to study art as a teenager, so it's over 50 years ago. And coming from digital arts, right, I was very aware of artists, designers, kind of media makers, editing films, right, or creating montages, kind of creatively working, sampling, resampling, remapping media. So I thought, well, each page of manga, each painting of, from Renaissance or Baroque, right, each visual object created by humans is not just a data point, right? If you reduce it to a data point, you can see larger patterns, but you don't see what's inside this image. So instead of automating the analytical process, which of course was a direction lots of digital humanities went to, and today people are excited about further automation using AI, right? Because you can automatically annotate things and find people on photographs and describe them, and that's wonderful. But if you reduce, or if you reduce images to text or to data points, to numbers, you throw away lots of information, and you throw the amazing human ability to look inside images and to see the whole world and to understand more. So I thought, right, why don't I make visualizations which actually consist from a small copies, small thumbnails of the actual objects, and then using, right, with huge screens, which were available to me exclusively, right? And I thought certainly by today, the screens will be common, this visualization sort of displays will be common in many labs, but instead, things went the opposite direction, right? So people try to do cultural analytics on a cell phone, where you're fairly limited. Right? We can kind of visualize things, so we can zoom in and out and interactively change dimensions. So in addition to seeing the patterns kind of revealed by measurements, so here we organize this million pages by 2 measurements, which happen to be standard deviation on a grayscale and entropy, and I can talk about it later. You can actually sort of zoom in and see these individual images and see much more, right? So the idea was not to replace the human analyst, so to speak, not to replace human art critic, art historian, literary scholar, architecture scholar, fan study scholar, and so on by computers, but rather augment human cultural perception and human cultural cognition, right? So when you look at these images, you notice more things, and you also understand what's going on because you're not looking at the data points. Anyway, so this is again familiar to many of you, so I will try to go through this quickly. So it's another visualization of 50,000 images of shared on Instagram. This one is in Tokyo 2013. So among many, first, our lab was also first to visualize and theorize and kind of describe in articles the large visual culture of Instagram in 2014. And then eventually I stopped doing, I don't know why I was not sure, so I was probably annotating something. Sorry, I just noticed this green line. So eventually I stopped, applying for grants. All my wonderful graduate students and postdocs graduated. And I spent 4 years writing this book, which came out from MIT Press, but not maybe in the best possible moment, which was the fall of 2020. So people were kind of more interested, I think, in dealing with COVID. And I was like waiting for reviews and waiting for some kind of feedback, and nothing happened. And only now people are reading these books, right? Like inviting me to talk about it. So I just realized I was too impatient. So I should have waited. Anyway, so I want to say a few things about the book. As I said, my assistant, I'm going to punish her, right? She left the PDF of the book on my website, manovich.net, so you can download it, but it shouldn't be possible, right? Anyway, so it was very strange to write a book about this research because it was like literally 2 weeks before my manuscript was due. MIT Press said, well, you can only have 16 images. So a book, I think, is a very convoluted, kind of strange object because I spent, 13 years doing this visual work. And then suddenly I have to reduce it to, 16 images. So if you're reading a book, please also go look at the website of our lab, where all these projects exist visually, but there are some nice pictures. Yeah, this is what you'll find if you go to the book webpage. So basically, one thing I want to say, right? So if you look at the table of content of a book, right? So there's a kind of first part, which is, kind of introduction, right? Especially for people who are outside of digital humanities, how do we study culture at scale? In particular, how do we study contemporary culture, where people uploading kind of many billions of images, right, every day. And in the last 2 years, the masses, right, the mass casual users have made more images using AI tools than, of course, all the photographs we ever shared on Instagram and Facebook before, right? So this kind of scale of culture is increasing. So, there are these introductory chapters from new media to media. What does it make sense to talk about the science of culture? And if I want to turn study of culture into a science, just because there are so many objects, right? So in a way, with science, the culture approach the condition of like physics or chemistry, right? Where there are so many atoms and so many molecules, you can talk about general principles, right? You can make general theories about molecules and atoms. I mean, you're not going to do some close analysis of a behavior of individual atom. And of course, this is what sociology and social scientists have done, right? In the end of the 19th century, we also tried to approach the study of society as a kind of natural science object. And Bruno Latour have criticized, right, social science for it, because he said it's actually a mistake, because there is only 6 billion or 7 billion people in the world. So it actually doesn't make sense to try to look at some associations, correlations, or rules, right, of social behavior. But now in the case of mass culture, right, where like 20 billion images being shared every day. So while the scale of society has never approached the scale of let's say natural world, right, where billions of like species, or the scale of a kind of cosmos, right, with billions of stars, or the scale of a kind of physical or chemical structure. The culture now does exist in this kind of scale of physics. So you ask this question, well, given that, what would it take to create the science of culture? Like what models would we use? Anyway, and then the last part of the book is focusing on visualization. And I try to suggest briefly why visualization is particularly important, why we adopted visualization as our main method, because especially in the case of visual culture, cinema, animation, cartoons, manga, book covers, mid-journey artworks, and so on, your objects are visual. So it doesn't make sense to reduce them to data points and to numbers. It makes sense to leave them maybe in some condensed, summarized, but still kind of visual way in your representation, right? And then, the middle part is to me most important, right? And you may wonder, okay, Lev, but why there are actually not chapters about analysis? Why you don't have chapters about time series analysis, or cluster analysis, or what used to be called dimension reduction, which is now called like latent space, right? Latent space representation visualization. Why you don't have it? Because as I was doing this research, I kind of came to realize, and again, this is my own idiosyncratic individual subjective idea, and I'm not saying it's right and wrong, that if you look at kind of digital humanities or cultural analytics or kind of related publications, right, the methods which we use are the same methods which are used across data science, right? And it's the same methods used in astronomy, biology, business, right? Because there is only one data science. There is not like multiple data science. But so then what is like unique about digital humanities or cultural analytics, right? Is there anything which kind of separates it from kind of data science as it is used in other fields? Well, so what's unique, of course, are the objects, right? Wherever you're looking at paintings of Van Gogh, or let's say, the programs of film festivals around the world, or 19th century novels, or something else, right? So what I realized, and this is why I structured the book in this particular way, is that in a way, the focus, right, of cultural analytics is how do you interact with objects, right? So I suggested that in the case of visual culture, we can use kind of this, what I call media visualizations, right? Visualization methods, which actually leave, right, parts of objects, right? Maybe sampling film in terms of film frames, or reducing, right, images to small thumbnails, right, and then doing it interactively. Right, so in a way, like at kind of this exploration output stage, what is the difference? And another difference comes at the beginning stage, right? So the key question is, how do we represent culture as data, right? And this question, I think, is often, as it always happens in academic fields, right? Once the field gets established, there are certain methods, there are certain paradigms which become kind of obvious and taken for granted. So I went to a cultural analytics conference, which was in Tallinn in December. Some papers were interesting, but to be honest, I was a bit disappointed because for many young researchers, it did become kind of like a almost mechanical workflow. We get hold of some data set because it's around. We do some kind of data science analysis. And then we publish a paper. But I think, to me, maybe what is most interesting question, which we should ask when we do cultural analytics or digital humanities every day, is how do you represent culture as data, right? So culture is not only images, because images circulate, right? Images have authors, images have readers. Culture is not only objects, it's also events, film festival, performances, people going for architectural buildings, parties, right? Meetups. Culture is also about interaction, right? Playing video games, interacting websites. And by the way, a big failure of digital humanities and cultural analytics is that we kind of deal with culture as though it existed in the 19th century, right? Mostly dealing with static cultural objects or cultural data. And we're actually not doing what industry doing, what people doing who design websites, or what people doing who are designing video games, which is analyzing contemporary interactive culture, right? 21st century culture is interactive. Video games, virtual reality, apps, and so on, right? But there is not really, much work, right, on this, and etc. Right. So here I talk about types of cultural data, right? For example, social networks and professional networks, behaviors, representing interactions, events, places, and organizations. And then, right, so how do you choose, or how do you create the objects? So it's not at all obvious that the analysis of culture in the 21st century should start with a bunch of novels, a bunch of digitized newspapers, a bunch of paintings. I know that I myself did this, but I always felt guilty, right? Because I thought that if this new approach to looking at culture, using this amazing computational kind of techniques and these amazing devices we call computers, and now we have AI, and you can do amazing cultural analytics, all the mechanical stuff using ChatGPT, right? You can ask it to describe images, you can ask it to format, tables, you can ask it to visualize data, right? So you can kind of teach the whole cultural analytics undergraduate classes, using ChatGPT, right? And using API, you can kind of do it on scale. But what about theoretical questions, right? Anyway, and then the question of sampling, right? So how do you create a sample? So I want to represent modernism. Well, how do I sample modernism, right? Do I start with including only the most important artists? But who decides, right? Well, who are important? Of course, we know that canons are historically constructed. We can be biased and so on and so forth, right? Maybe if I want to represent, let's say, art in 1929, I actually have to include like few famous people and then lots of people who were not famous, right? So if I go and I want to study, let's say, Instagram today, right? I mean, do I take influencers or do I take people who photograph their kind of burgers and their food, right? So I think there's a whole theory of cultural sampling, which should be developed. And this will be another difference between cultural analytics and general data science, which just uses kind of statistics, right? But the normal statistics, it's too mechanical for us, right? So we have to ask these questions, right? For example, if we're digitizing films and we're going to, spend, or, this is some national library somewhere and it's digitizing, artwork, right? Do we only digitize what's important, or do we also digitize what is typical, or do we also digitize what is bad to have like a more balanced sample, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And then the key chapters for me, which are chapters 6 and 7, is really, I'm trying my best to explain, right, what is the most interesting, the most important, and also the most challenging part of looking at culture with computers, and it is the ability, right, to capture small differences, right, and to describe cultural objects, right, in terms of numerical scales. So, for example, if I want to analyze movement in a dance, right, I want to analyze contemporary dance using this method as opposed to using language and to say that this movement is brisk, this movement is fast, this movement is slow. And of course, language has metaphors, which are amazing, but the language did not evolve evolutionary, right, to differentiate between small nuances, right? So the numbers, the features extracted by computer vision, and then visualization, where we can position images or points, right? With very fine kind of distinction, here and here, can represent, right? Can represent these differences much better, right? So to me, the most important thing, right, about cultural analytics and digital humanities, it's not even the fact that we can look at culture at scale and we can find kind of patterns, in 19th century literature or history of art and so on, because often these patterns are what we expect to find anyway. It's the fact that the computers and the numbers and visualization give us a completely new language which can talk about continuity and small differences, right? And what I want to do is, very briefly, right, show some examples, which of course are familiar to few of you, but maybe not to everybody. Let's see here. So I'll do it very briefly. Okay, let's not do this one. Okay, right? Okay. So this maybe okay. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So I was also teaching these ideas, right, and the tools which I coded and then also coded by people in my lab in undergraduate classes. So this is like kind of digital art class around 2011, and I would show students examples of work of our lab, and I give them the tools. And because we were digital art students, the smartest one would figure out things very quickly. And so I said, let's go online and find enough images of impressionist artists. And this is 2011, right? So this data sets didn't really exist. We actually had to find these images. And then a week later, right, the student brings me this work, which I think is a perfect example of this method, right? So we have a few hundred paintings by 5 impressionist artists. And I forgot, so I think I guess X is a saturation, although it doesn't seem it works. And Y dimension is a vertical dimension measurement of hue, right? And you can see the kind of distribution with paintings in relation to the hue. And there is so much, right, you can talk about, right? So this is all the artists combined. So you can see how in this kind of hue space, right, these paintings create a particular kind of geographic continent, so to speak, right? So some colors are more prominent, right? Some colors are less prominent. And you start wondering, right, why all these painters who are kind of different have somewhat of a similar profile, maybe because we live in Paris and then in the summer we would go and work in the same places outside of Paris. And when you start asking yourself, well, are we actually all similar, or are we actually all different, right? And what are these outliers? It's great. But here comes, right? Here comes the challenge. This is the challenge, right? Which I promised to talk to you about. And that's what you eventually, in a few years, I realized. And that's why at some point, I basically, like after 13 years, I stopped doing this work, because at this point, I thought this challenge, or this limitation, this Achilles heel of quantitative analysis is so important that maybe I shouldn't do it. But now, 4 years later, maybe I should, right? So on the one hand, right, we don't have to describe a hue, right? Using linguistic categories, we can kind of measure the hue, let's say on a scale of like 360, right? So the hue now represented by number, and then we position, these paintings, right, according to these measurements. So the hue is mapped into vertical position, right? So on the one hand, we get this very rich and very kind of similarly precise representation. But in the same time, we come across this Achilles heel, which is common to statistics as it develops in the 18th century, kind of machine learning as it develops in 1940s, 1950s, and today AI, because we all share the same idea and the same problem, which is they summarize data, they aggregate data, right? And when you summarize data, any kind of data, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work very well, right? So in the 19th century, when the concept of descriptive statistics, such as mean, kind of mode, and median, were just becoming adopted, it was not obvious to people that these are meaningful concepts, right? There was lots of pushback. And in fact, people said, look, if you have a distribution, which is like a Gaussian, right? Like a normal distribution, right? Then the mean, in fact, makes sense because it captures, right, the central tendency of the distribution. And this is where, like, right, most numbers are. But if you have, let's say, flat distribution, right, over, so if you plot it, you have like a flat line, or maybe you have a binomial distribution, then the mean is kind of meaningless. In addition, you can have endless number of distributions which will have the same mean and the same variance, right? So the genius of statistics, and by extension, machine learning, and today AI, and this is not a comment on ChatGPT Midjourney, because of course people with companies or startups are incredibly clever, so we have all kinds of tricks to take care of it. And of course, because this networks are very large, they're often better. So the result of Midjourney is better at it than DALL-E 3. But the fact remains, right, that when you apply statistics, machine learning, or what we so-called generative AI, right? When you do this, so you analyze data using statistics, you summarize it, you aggregate it, you fit maybe a line or a curve using linear regression, or when we go to the 20th century, now you do PCA from 1901, or cluster analysis from 1950s, or et cetera, right? You reduce information. And the same thing happens with machine learning, right? So you take, for example, billions of images and there are text descriptions, and you reduce it to one file, right? The neural network, which has just a few gigabytes in size. And in this reduction, information is lost. So if you want to analyze, like, let's say, the typical trends, right? Trend lines, right? In some cases, it's okay, but is it okay for culture, right? Because the culture is all about exceptions. The culture is all about individual paintings, the individual artist, and so on, right? So if you look at this, right, what happens is that, I don't know if I can zoom in here, maybe not. Okay, well, maybe I can zoom in, right? Maybe not. We kind of, right, we position these paintings, according to these averages of hue, where the computer looks at all the pixels in each image and gives us one number, right? Kind of mean or median of hue. So when you zoom out, right, it looks very convincing, and you can see that, in fact, there is a particular, like almost like ecological, so to speak, footprint, right? Well, ecological, I mean metaphorically. But when you zoom in, you said, well, actually, it doesn't work very well, right? Because this painting is on the same level as this painting, but we're very different. Why? Because we have the same mean. So the stupid computer puts them, right, on the same vertical level, but in reality, we're very different painting. So, so this is basically, what I see. I mean, it's a very simple idea, but I think it's also very profound, because when I started using generative AI, which I use almost every day now, right? I'm making images, I'm having art exhibitions. I kind of went from, only dealing with like, thousands or tens of thousands of millions of images. And 10 years ago, I told people I would never make another image. I would never look at another image. I'm only interested in patterns. But once I realized that when you extract patterns, when you kind of reduce culture to data, and you use the tools of statistics or machine learning, we find, or sometimes very obvious differences between artifacts, right? I get thrown out, and I see kind of the same challenge sometimes, not always, with ChatGPT, let's say written text, right? Like you're basically trying to write recommendation letter for your student. It's very grammatical, except you say, well, this is actually, it can fit millions of students. There's nothing specific, right, about this particular student. Or you're trying to make images, with DALL-E 3, right? You say, well, I want to make an image in the style of Rembrandt. But Rembrandt, every line is different. Every line is unique. So why is DALL-E 3, draws the image, which has a very regular shading? In fact, it's so regular that if you give the same image back to ChatGPT, it will say, yeah, this is an image. I can see it immediately. Anyway, so let's look at a few more examples. So this is, this manga, right, visualization, which I showed earlier. And again, right, it's on the one hand, I think exemplifies, what is really interesting and exciting about looking at culture with data. In the same time, it also exemplifies this fundamental challenge, right? So this is not the highest resolution image. I think this is 10,000 by 10,000 pixels. So, but anyway, we can zoom in, right? Of course, you don't see the whole million of images because they're like overlaid, right? So you maybe see only the top layer. I was very happy because this was a software I wrote, and I was running it on the iMac in 2010, which was, of course, many times slower than it was today. It took 48 hours to render, right? And, when I made it and I was showing it for years, and I was very happy because I said, look, we have this dimension, which is vertical again here, which happens to be entropy, right? Which means the images which are on the top have lots of details, right? Lots of texture. It takes longer to make them because from a statistical point of view, they're less predictable, right? Because if you go and look at the upper left pixel, it's harder to predict what is the next pixel, so the entropy is larger, right? And then as you kind of go down, I would give this lecture and I would kind of make this, like I had this Lev move, right? I would kind of go down, right? I would go down and say, look, slowly we can see the entropy is decreasing. There are larger areas of a single tone, right? With less detail, etc., 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 etc. And then eventually, we get to complete opposite, right? And I said, this is fantastic, right? This is exactly kind of what I wanted to do, right? Because let's say in a kind of art history version, in our history paradigm of somebody like Wolfe, he says, well, if we, we have this and we have this opposites. Of course, he was talking about Renaissance and Baroque, but people would use this, for our approaches, right? So you can look at culture in terms of binary oppositions, of course, with structuralism in the 1960s, but now we can look at culture. Here we're looking at a stylistic field, right? What I call style space of manga, but you can also look at the evolution of, let's say, magazine covers or one manga title or cinema over time. and we can see with continuity. I said, that's very interesting. So it actually turns out that if we look at the big enough cultural data set, 1 million pages, right, from most popular, I think it was like 800 something manga publications, it actually turns out that on this particular dimension, of course, there are other dimensions, but on this particular dimension, we don't see clusters, right? We don't see categories, we see continuity. So one kind of style, let's say one style extreme, gradually becomes another style extreme, right? So I said, that's very exciting, but a few years later, I realized that, of course, in my excitement, I'm not paying attention to something, right? That if you actually look closely, you'll see that, of course, you may have, actually it works pretty well here because it's so big. But for example, you can see you have this kind of like dark pages next to these light pages, which are very different to us, right? To a human observer, but to a computer, we're the same because we have the same measure of entropy, right? So again, if you reduce these pages with images to kind of data points, you get this beautiful distribution. So it actually does look a bit like a Gaussian, but in reality, I realized that this claim I was making, that this kind of big data approach suggests that if you look at culture at a big enough scale, let's say, I don't know, in 19th century literature or 20th century visual art, we're not going to see only isms. We're not going to see like particular distinct genres. We're going to see this continuity, but perhaps it's also artifact with new method of measurement, right? Because when you analyze culture for language, you put things in distinct categories, correspond to distinct labels. You say this is drama, this is lyric art, this is novels, this is newspaper writing. Whereas if you measure things, right, the computer is great in measuring these details because you represent things on a scale 1 to 100, 1 to 1,000, 1 to a million, and now you see continuity. So this continuity, which we see here, it's like in a way, right, like how like in physics, right, your instruments are affecting what you're looking at. So what we're seeing is partly an artifact, right, of a particular method of measurement, right? And it's kind of hard, impossible to separate the measurement from the picture of a sea, right? So on the one hand, it's very exciting. On the other hand, it's also very frustrating. I'll just show kind of maybe a few more things. And then, okay, let's see. Okay. But, things can be, also, but at the same time, right, this is, I think, interesting result. So I said, okay, so if I'm looking at 1 million manga pages, because there is 1 million, and I kind of map them using this new method, what I see is that there are no clusters, right? There are no categories. There is a kind of distinct change from one extreme to another. So somehow all these images, as they're drawn and shaded by thousands of manga artists, kind of fill this evolutionary tree, so to speak. But what about individual manga titles, right? Because we downloaded over 1 million pages in 2010, and we had access to individual titles. Surely, I said, what I've been told all my life in art history, literary studies, in film studies, culture studies, is that artworks have a style, right? Yes, there are exceptions like Picasso, and there are also many artists today who have multiple styles, but normally in a classical culture, modern culture, most people have particular style. And surely such kind of mass culture form as manga, right? One title, a short title, which is just 1,000 pages, right, would also have a style. Well, it turns out I was wrong, right? So this is about 1,000 pages from a particular manga title called like Anatolia's Story, and they are mapped also using kind of similar methods. And we can see that, in fact, there is a huge variety, right, of kind of styles, kind of renderings, also black and white and color within one title. So when I did this to, I think now I remember we had 873, okay, yeah, I think around 800 different manga titles. So I mapped all of them, and I found out that, yeah, some had more stylistic coherence, so the images would be all like in one area with plot, but a big proportion did not, right? So this was an amazing, right? Because again, as a cultural critic, you kind of assume a priori that a work has a style, and when you're looking for some differences between these works and other works, and if you're doing digital humanities, you would reduce this work to a point, and then you position all these points, right, in a latent space. But now it turns out you can't reduce this work to a point because the work is all over the place. So this is, I think, one, I mean, I didn't have it many examples like that, but that's one interesting example of how looking at big data gave me the idea, and then I applied this idea to small data, and I found something interesting about the small data. So maybe just, yeah, maybe, what do you think? Maybe just 5 more minutes, and then hopefully, is it already too long, or we have?
Yeah, I mean, 5 more minutes would be exactly the time we usually take.
Perfect, yeah.
Like an hour.
Okay,
so yeah.
And then, okay, so then, you know, in this case, let me just show one thing. Let me just show one thing. Let me show one thing. Okay, one thing, just to continue with this topic here. Okay, so so one thing you can also do, right? One thing you can also do is you can also try to, sorry. Let me actually, what you can also do, just make it a bit bigger, yeah. You can try to visualize how things change in time. And as opposed to doing it only in 2 dimensions, like time is X and some kind of feature or combination of features, a PCA1 or whatever in Y, you can actually animate it. So again, this is all from 2011. So I try to use this approach to look at the kind of evolution of particular artists to see if it works. So basically, what is the movement of a person in what we call style space? And I use the following trick, right? So we digitize all or most of, you know, I'm not sure. My students said all, but maybe it wasn't all, who knows? Can never trust students, but trust. That's why. So basically digitize around 140 paintings created by Piet Mondrian between 1907 and 1918. Right? And what I've done is that I measured, like using again software we wrote, we measured around 250 features. And when we did principal component analysis, now you would do t-SNE and you would get a bit better results. And basically we kind of visualized all these paintings, right? In a 2-dimensional latent space, right? So you can see how it more or less works, right? So the paintings are grouped and positioned in space where the paintings which are visually similar are next to each other. Always doesn't work perfectly, right? For example, these paintings should have been somewhere else. Anyway, so this is 140 paintings. Let's say a good sample or most of production of Mondrian. You know, when he arrives, right, with kind of his canonical style, right? So he starts as a figurative painter here, and then eventually he gets, like, we didn't quite get to the end, right? When he gets his kind of Mondrians, but he goes through a number of changes. And then I did a trick where what I've done is I said, okay, now what I will do is now I will animate it by putting these images into the plot by time. So starting with kind of final PCA, where images are positioned, right, according to the visual differences, we can see how he moves in this kind of in this style space. So that's, of course, is a trick. It's not completely honest, but I think it's still very suggestive, right? So let me show you how it works. Okay. Basically works like this. Okay. Like, I think it's one of the most interesting things we have done. Okay. So what you can see is that, right, in the beginning, he's kind of stuck, right? He makes these images which are, you know, occupy just a small part of the space. They're quite similar to each other. But you can also see that in a way we already anticipate his late abstraction, because there's a a huge degree of simplification. And we're kind of waiting for his breakthrough, right? Waiting. Still, right? Okay, I think we have a date here, right? So 1906. Okay, sorry, so I was starting a bit earlier. Waiting, and waiting. Boom, right? So with painting, I mean, I don't think our historians paid much attention to it, right? But you can say it's actually most important because this is his breakthrough, right? This is when he kind of breaks out from this part of a style space. But what's interesting, right? He immediately, when in a way gets scared. Now I'm like narrating this kind of Hollywood narration, so it's a bit dramatic. Back, right? He goes back and when he goes forward, right? So he doesn't just go from one part of creative space to another part. He kind of goes back and forth. And then eventually he kind of goes. He goes here, right? So he keeps going. Every time he goes back, he goes further, right? So very interesting kind of movement. And then he keeps expanding, right? His range of explorations, right? He makes very light paintings. He makes very saturated paintings, right? Okay. And he also, etc. Now, of course, you would say, this can be improved, right? Because this was before Disney. You can now extract, this was like manual features. Now you can extract features using, again, neural networks. So you can improve it. You can't improve it perfectly because you're still reducing a very complex multi-dimensional space of visual differences and visual features onto 2 dimensions. But you can improve it. But you also find something strange, right? Because you can say the painting which really stands out here is this one. This is not a very good painting, right? So the painting which is statistically, in a way, most interesting, right? And throw away from everything else, which computer would say, actually, that's maybe his most unique painting this period is not really interesting to us. And again, right, the problem is that it's so wonderful, except this painting are next to each other, and they're very different, right? And again, you can improve it. You can use newer kind of feature analysis, etc. But you can't completely kind of solve this problem because probably there are hundreds of different relevant dimensions, right, to these paintings. And you have a space of, I don't know, 50 or 100 or 200 dimensions, and you're reducing it to use, and then everything will be lost, the things will get distorted, and the objects, which are very different from each other, will turn out to be next to each other, right? So I'm going to kind of conclude. So this, of course, is just one example, but in general, this is one of a number, right, of key challenges of looking at culture as data, as I see them. And it's also the challenge of artificial intelligence, right, or large-scale deep neural networks, right? Because whenever you're doing statistics and you're simply aggregating data into categories, or you're doing machine learning and you're doing cluster analysis, or you're kind of fitting the data with a trend line, right, regression, or you're training the network to extract patterns, you're always doing reduction, right? And this reduction is both a very powerful intellectual instrument, which is kind of mechanical, right, reduction, which you can delegate to computers, which humans, let's say, began doing in the 18th century sometime, right, more or less. If you say statistics is born more or less in the middle of 18th century, of course, it's also a continuous development, right? And then machine learning in the 20th century and AI today, right? So why are we all very different? So statistics tries to reduce patterns into, let's say, categories. Machine learning, right, is dealing with more like continuous spaces. So you're doing cluster analysis, classification, regression, and so on. And generative AI is actually kind of reducing the data internally. But what the tools do is they generate new data points, right, which have the same statistical properties as your distribution. But what we all share, right, is that we say here is hill of reduction. So I illustrated it using the challenge of cultural analytics or digital humanities, but it's only just one example. And you can't get rid of it, right? It's not like bias you can fix, right? Okay, you can go fix the bias in data, right? You can do, you can, I don't know, you can do this and that. But you can't fix this challenge because by definition, to learn something, right, is to extract pattern. And extracting patterns means you reduce information, right? So I think this very fundamental challenge will remain with us. And of course, people at Midjourney Lab or OpenAI or other companies are incredibly clever. And we can see, how some of their tools in some situations, right, are getting better. So if you, for example, use Midjourney, which is the leading visual AI generator, and why it is the leading, because precisely we can figure out how to, I think, take care of it. So if you use it properly, if you, use a stylistic reference, if you make prompts long enough, etc., you can get very, very, very individual things. But in general, this problem remains that, and of course, how can it not remain? Because let's say if you think about the size of a data set used to train visual AIs, which is billions of images, right? I mean, huge data set, even if you reduce it to one neural network, which encodes its patterns, which is only, a few gigabytes. So this, I think, is the challenge which is common to both data science in general, the application of data science to humanities, which we call digital humanities or cultural analytics, and to the new kind of right game in town, which is generative AI, right, is that how do you preserve, how do you visualize, how do you describe individuality? Because after all, if you look at history of culture, right, the people we admire, we're all outliers. El Greco was outlier. Giotto was outlier. Picasso was outlier. George O'Keeffe was outlier. Susan Sontag was outlier, right? And if you apply this mechanical methods, right, well, the computer will simply take them out of a data set because will be outside of any cluster, will be too far from your regression line and so on. Anyway, so this is the talk. As you can see, I didn't use my notes. Turns out it was all in my head, which I had no idea. I hope it made some sense. Of course, I compressed both my book and the possible second book, which I'll never write, which is a critique of my own book, in less than an hour. But I do hope that some ideas were clear, and I hope we'll have a nice discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Lev. This was thanks you for the compression. It was a very good compression, I think. And as always, eye-opening. And we have some questions in the Q&A actually. And I could maybe read them and then paste them in. So the first one, which is already in the answered section, because there was some discussion around it. Why did you choose to publish the book in closed access? Wouldn't open access lead to more visibility and enable further research interactions? And I feel sorry if I miss it. Is there an access to an open data set, data from your research? And this is the question from Linda Martin from FU. And we discussed that the book is actually available on your website, but the
book is available illegally because when I was publishing a book in 2019, there was no option to do it in the last few years, partly because of kind of Zoom revolution and COVID. More presses, including MIT Press, started to publish books using open access. But some of you know, well, I don't want to say it because it's going to sound very crazy, but in a way, I invented kind of open access in humanities because I've been publishing everything online from 94, right? From my first article. And in the last few years, without telling the presses, I actually put my books as PDFs on my website, right? Or my assistant did, sorry, yes. Yes, remains unpunished. And I also have two books, the Instagram book and also the new one, right? Artificial Aesthetics about generative AI, which I'm just completely publishing online. I'm not even trying to publish when the presses. As far as the data sets for our projects, so we did 43, 44 projects in our lab. So lots of data sets. Whenever any researchers ask us for them, we make them available. Again, I just kept going during these years, right? I tried to explore as many possibilities. So I was not concerned with, like organizing data sets for others, publishing them, etc. Because I think in digital humanities in general, like there is too much work dealing with what I would call bureaucratic part, metadata, open access. It's all great. You should just go do work and come up with great ideas, So I don't know if our ideas were great, but we try to go as quickly as possible. The whole lab was me and one full-time postdoc for 4 years. So, we did 43 projects, published 30 articles, got 16 grants, and kind of started with, in a way, with Paradigm. And the data sets, we're lying on some hard drives. Some is hard drives I can boot up and some are not. Let's see. Let me go. Daniel, is it okay if I kind of deal with questions but not in the order we were written?
Yeah, as you wish.
Because
if you want to take over, then you just read them and then I will post them.
It's like something. Sorry, just microphones. It keeps like switching to different microphones. I don't know why. Okay, no, it's okay. The speaker. It's okay. Yeah, no. So Daniel is asking, I have a provocative questions, right? So you've been analyzing culture of digital methods for decades. Well, not decades, but just since 2008. So that's about, I don't know how many, 16 years. Okay. Did you ever had some sort of epiphany moment? This is how manga works. Does cultural analytics ever bring this kind of scholarly satisfaction? Well, I had many aha moments. In fact, I was so excited about doing this work. Let's say, once I figured out the method from 2008 till about 2015. During this period, I haven't answered my mail. Like, I was just in the lab like all the time. And in fact, this is why I had to eventually leave UCSD and go to New York, because I was on campus every single day in the lab. But I was so excited doing these works. And I was having so many wow moments that I neglected some of my department duties. And then it came to the time to get promotion. Every single person in the department got promotion, but not me, because people some colleagues in the department said, well, he's never around. In fact, with colleagues were living in LA and commuting to San Diego, and I was on campus of our university every day, but I didn't go to some of the meetings. Right? So, in fact, I suffered. So obviously, it was extremely, extremely amazing. And, all these visualizations, which are usually shown in my lectures, whether it's manga or, impressionism or, video games, were very amazing. Now, the question is, right? If I'll become evil Lev for a second, right, and I will try to attack, the Lev who was so excited about it 10, 15 years ago, why it was so amazing, right? Was it amazing because the images I was creating were interesting to me enough artistically, right? I mean, obviously this image of 1 million manga, right? is quite exciting, and it is a new image of culture, right? And the image of 5,000 time covers, which some of you know, was also very exciting. So I think to give it justice, we were amazing both as a visual artifacts and in ways that kind of these postmodern objects where you create art out of our art, but instead of using remix, right, use this statistical visualization methods, right, to project these artworks into the patterns, right? But as you can see, if you see like this image behind me, this is one of our visualizations. This is from our photo trail projects 2014, which, as I mentioned, was the first academic work on analyzing, visualizing Instagram. It's more exciting when if I simply make it scatter plot, right, of like points, because you can see what each of these little thumbnails, it's like a star. So in a way, it's like astronomy, right? You know that you can zoom in, you can fly to the star, and you can look inside this manga image, and there is so much more, right? And I think in some cases, I had some kind of theoretical insights, and I try to share this one insight with you, given the limited time which I had, right? About the style space and how perhaps in many cases the cultural fields or genres or particular artworks do not have a style. I think that what I also want to say, and this is actually something which was in my notes, but I didn't get to it. In the same time, I felt a kind of disappointment at the end. And this was my disappointment, right? So as some of you know, right, in my work, my whole life, I focused on visual culture, not media, visual culture, how to understand images, how to understand visual communication, why things look the way they look, right? In particular periods, and when I saw that the computers were going to have a major effect on contemporary visual culture, I turned to computers, both as an artist, as an educator, teaching digital art, and you're also using those digital methods, right? So that's what I've been doing for 40 years, because I started to work in computer animation in 1984, so 40 years, right? And what I try to do, right, in my work, especially in the 90s and 2000, is to figure out new dimensions, right? New terms, new concepts, which we need to understand with kind of changing visual culture as it is affected by computers. And of course, this is what this book, which some of you know, The Language of Media, was all about. So I basically borrow the concepts from the computational layer, so to speak, right? And I make them into a kind of humanistic concepts, right? So I talk about database versus narrative. I talk about cultural interface. I talk about navigable space. And I think the book was, was successful partly because I did manage to come up with like a set of new concepts. So when I started doing cultural analytics, right, in 2007, of course, I was very excited about this idea. Oh my God, like if you look at millions of manga pages, what is this style space of manga? If we look at, I don't know, millions of websites of artists, designers, museums, what are the cultural trends? Like how do particular ideas emerge over time, right? Almost like a global weather mapping, right, on a global scale, but instead of mapping weather, we'll be mapping cultural trends. But I also have this idea, and this partly worked out, but here's the thing which didn't work out. What I was really hoping for is that these new computational tools will allow me and will allow others to come up with new concepts, new categories, to talk about culture and digital interactive culture of our time, right? But eventually I will have something like a language of media where I will take ideas, perhaps from data science, perhaps from AI, and I would kind of like humanize them, right? And I would present them as a new language of global, large-scale, dynamic cultural flows, right? And that didn't happen. And in fact, this is also my criticism, and I think some more people expressed it, of digital humanities in general, that was something very traditional, right? Very conservative about digital humanities, because you say, okay, we're going to be looking at 1 million books. So you take book as an object. And we'll be talking about, I don't know, so many authors. So you take author, right, as a kind of like, as a single object, even though author was criticized, right, by Foucault, Barthes, everybody else, right? So in a way, you kind of almost like you take this 1920 to 1940 kind of humanities textbook, and you just kind of mechanically apply data science to it, but you don't use the later questioning of idea of text, author, readership, and so on, right? So I thought, well, we have these images people share on Instagram, or videos people share on TikTok. And they're not just this kind of normal static things you put in a museum, but they remix, right? They kind of tagged, they enter into the search engines. So the image functions differently, right? So how can we describe it? We need like a new concept for it. But these tools, right, in a way almost pushed me towards this more conservative, right, more traditional, more old-fashioned look at the culture as databases or data sets made from discrete objects which have metadata. And so this is I think to me was a big disappointment, that at least in my case, and I don't see it in others, but I think maybe it's just particular period we're in, which is not a very theoretical period, right? If people in the 60s, had the computers, of the speed and scale we have today, they would know what to do. We just don't know. And I think the questions I would get after my lectures 10 years ago, honestly, were more interesting than the questions I get now. AI is getting smarter every day, every moment. I'm not sure about us. So this to me was a big disappointment that these tools didn't do it. Of course, maybe I just didn't do it a good enough job, because I think like the style space can be a theoretical concept. And in fact, a colleague of mine in Paris, he's now publishing a book which will be open access in the fall, which is about generative AI. And in this book, he will basically put forward latent space as the new theoretical concept. So maybe, it still can be done, right? So latent space or feature space is, I think, a new theoretical concept. Cluster analysis, right, clusters can be a theoretical concept. Obviously, I think networks is one area, right, where the kind of computational mathematical analysis has also become theoretical ones, but that's because people were theorizing networks already in the 40s and 30s in social sciences, so it came before. But let me just say, and then I think one of the reasons it didn't really happen as much as I hope is that the audience for this kind of work is not very big, because you need to have people who really have nuanced understanding of contemporary culture, which are typically only people in humanities, so in the arts, not social sciences, not media studies, not sciences. And you have people who understand kind of the math, right? And will not run away if you start talking about multidimensional space. And there are not so many people like this, whereas maybe a bit more than 10 years ago, but not so many. So if I, in the language of the media, I said, look, let's think about interface as a theoretical concept. Well, you didn't have to have knowledge of math to understand it. It's kind of obvious, right? Well, interface, well, like I have interface in my computer. But if I say, well, let's think about multidimensional latent space as a kind of theoretical concept, people don't, right? People don't, I mean, even for us, it's difficult to understand this, right? Because we can't touch it. And for normal people, right? Just people who are like obsessed with writing about biases and publishing their books about, like, it's about this. Like they're going to lose them, right? So the problem is that mathematics, right, and computational mathematics, so to speak, and data science do give us amazing new concepts to talk about things. But if people don't have mathematical knowledge, you can't use this concept with them as a humanities concept. Anyway, sorry, this is a very long answer.
Thanks for the answer. But
it's something I wanted. Yeah, it's something I wanted to cover anyway in my talk. Yeah. So let's see what else. I don't know. I'm just looking at what I mean. What Robert is? Can I ask? Robert is asking about Laszlo Barabasi. So Laszlo Barabasi, right, is a kind of famous person. He just was elected to the American Academy of Sciences. So he's at Northeastern, and he was one of the pioneers of kind of network science in the late 90s. And he's a very curious person. And then in the last 6-7 years, his students, his postdocs, published many papers applying network science to all kinds of things, for example, analysis of artists' careers, etc., etc. So he's definitely one of the most creative people at the intersection of data science, kind of, let's say, the science of a quantitative, so to speak, right? And culture. And he gets, obviously, I mean, he gets very good students, right? I've been to his lab, and I'm told that, I met him a few times. He only accepts students or postdocs in his lab if he is pretty much sure in a few years we can publish paper in Science and Nature. He's not interested like in some kind of papers in regular. He only wants papers in Science and Nature. So he is very, very clever. He also did very interesting work about the kind of fame and the careers. It's a great work. If you look at it closely, for example, if you look closely at his work about artist career, you will see the data set we used was problematic. Like it didn't include, for example, lots of museums or galleries from Asia, etc., etc. But that's a problem of all this work. But definitely, he's one of the most interesting, people, and he is really one of the few people who is really truly interdisciplinary. So I admire him. What other question you want me to ask? Daniel, what other question you want me to ask? You want me to answer?
I mean, maybe the answer the question by Francis Harvey, like about your prognosis about return to spatiality in the 21st century. What's your current assessment?
Well, did I ever say that? Return to spatiality.
Not that I know, but
No. I'm just curious. Well, so in the 1980s and 90s, right, where kind of things were more theoretical in humanities, were right with kind of big debates about postmodernism as a kind of flattening history, flattening time, and kind of privileging space over time, right? So some people said that 19th century was the kind of century obsessed with time. You have invention of kind of history, right? You also historical novel, Hagen White writing about that. And then, of course, in the 90s, you have World Wide Web, which in a way kind of mechanically have definitely, in some sense, abolished time, where, for example, like all the films created during the history of cinema are now available to you like on the same interface. So I think that speciality in that sense have already happened in the 1980s. And then if you maybe remember, like around the end of the Cold War, like, right, the collapse of Soviet Union, was this famous book about the kind of end of history, the end of ideology, right? Because it was great, in the West, and the building of communism in the East collapsed, right? Of course, now we have a new historical narrative, which is we're planning slow dying, climate change, but we'll see about that. But definitely nobody's kind of building communism except humanities, humanities scholars in America, right? Always kind of in their minds, right? So I think the speciality in a way has already triumphed over temporality. thousands of other the present has become more important, right? So when you posted something on social media, a second later, it like in a way recedes, right, into the history. And while you can search Facebook and Instagram, it's very limited, right? So it's like so there's this kind of eternal present and the flattening of differences. So maybe, but I don't know, maybe the question meant speciality in some other sense. Not sure. And then there was a question about Elena. A lot of time, data science is using explorative tool that can highlight some statistically significant point in big data sets. But as I pointed out, the objects which are statistically significant, they may be not interesting to us humans, right? As I pointed out, like there's just one painting, which is really outlier in this kind of stylistic space of Mondrian. So the computer says, this is a really interesting image, but to us, it's actually not interesting at all. It's actually not his greatest painting. So do you think maybe it makes more sense to know the data sets in advance and to use data science to find new ways to interact with them? Or do you see still the role of data science for exploration? Well, we think about knowing the data sets in advance. Here's the thing, right? So if you're dealing with like, so maybe I can turn this question a bit around and also try to motivate you, right? A bit. Say, leave you with something kind of more positive, right, at the end. So, so in the case of Mondrian, right, there are hundreds of books about Mondrian, right? There are experts about Mondrian. You can invite this expert like in your team, in your room. You can say what we should look at, Of course, often these experts have no idea because, as I said, the people in humanities use natural language to talk about visual culture and media, and natural language historically evolves, right, after the census, right? So it kind of deals with categories. And I remember talking to, I'm sorry, I will not name her name. So she's like the main curator of photography at MoMA in New York, right? So I talked to her like 10 years ago. And, like at this point, MoMA invited me to do some project using visualization tools. And she said, Lev, I have this idea. I said, what's the idea? Well, maybe we can take like MoMA collection of like art photography, and we can like, you can use your tools. And so I have this hypothesis which I wanted to test. I said, what? Well, 1930s, there is a fascism, right? There's like depression in America. So maybe you'll find that photographs became darker. Just brightness, right? Just brightness was darker, right? I'm like, oh my God, this is creating a moment, right? I wish I kind of want to forget this conversation, right? Because it also shows that even professionals often don't have a very sophisticated and visual knowledge, right? But if you want to look at contemporary culture, right? Look, think about the table as a metaphor, right? So here's like, your paintings, here's your novels, here's your video games. And then there's the rest, right? 99% or 99.9 what people produce today, nobody kind of has any time or tools or ideas to analyze it, right? I mean, people upload, right? It's not all food pictures. It's not all selfies. Lots of them are amazing, right? I mean, you can go to Instagram, you can find like amazing collection of images about like urban minimalism or this and that using hashtag, right? So we actually have no idea about contemporary culture, right? Because there are tens of millions of people creating it, very enabled by software, right? We look at each other, we learn from each other, and someone is very sophisticated, right? How many articles are there analyzing the stylistic universe of deviant art Or in Russia, right, there was this project where this website is prose.com, right, and poetry.com, where I think there was like literally millions of people submitting their poems and submitting their short stories. And I think it was a project, right, in Moscow, I think at Wishka, right, they tried to, right, we started working on it, but then kind of war happened, and I don't think the project, right. So what I'm saying is that we actually, because of the scale of contemporary culture, we have no idea what's going on, but it's safe to assume that lots of it, with enough of it, is amazing. And the only way, right, the only way perhaps to realistically look at it is using these computational tools, right? So while these tools can indeed find things which are interesting to them, which are not interesting to us, I still think that my original kind of vision of cultural analytics is this new kind of both telescope and microscope, right? To simply look at contemporary culture, I think is still important, just because otherwise, everybody will be writing about Venice Biennale, which is like completely probably least interesting part of contemporary culture, right? So why like 100 articles about Venice Biennale, right? Why not have 100 articles about something else, right? So as a kind of exactly method for dealing with cultural data where actually you don't know and there are no experts, right? I think it's very important because for 99% of contemporary culture, there are no experts. Nobody is looking at it. The only experts are like users, the creators. So you can go to the bulletin boards, you can go to the forums, right? We know who's important, so you can start, so you can do the ethnography, but there are no academic experts, right? Because of the scale of contemporary culture, right? There are no physicists or chemists or biologists of contemporary culture because of its scale. I think it was another question, no? Where
There was another question by Yasha Schmitz. Yes, about your case with Mondrian. Maybe that's something you could answer. Thinking of culture beyond data.
Yes. So how do you think this analyzing culture as changing practice over time can become more central for digital research? Exactly. So when I was like trying to come up with definitions of cultural analytics, when I was more actively doing it 10, 12 years ago, like I was constantly rewriting the kind of bio, a description of a website, and at some point I said it's analysis of cultural data flows, interactions. So I think the network science, right, the network approach is definitely, you can say, one new major kind of technical and also theoretical innovation developed in the 90s, which does deal with connections, right? Of course, it is, right? So you can kind of take a snapshot of some phenomena and map it as a network, but you can also visualize it as kind of, right, things change over time. And the network, right, approach has been applied successfully in dozens of fields. The problem, of course, is that once you start looking at things as a network, everything becomes a network, right? But having said that, it also makes a great sense to apply this tool because the social networks are networks, right? So the social networks are built in a way by people who know network science, right? So the connection graph, right? The whole idea of sharing, right? Resharing. So it kind of there's a perfect symmetry between using network tools to study social media because the social media is a network, right? In fact, the social networks is the only part of culture where there is this kind of symmetry, right, between the tool and the cultural mechanism. When we look at literature, when we look at books, I don't know, when we look at cinema, when we look at video games, our tools are very foreign, right? Like in a way, we can superimpose in our tools, right, onto these objects only in the area of networks with this connection. But having said that, of course, there are also limits, right, to this network approach, because first of all, the scale, and secondly, the dynamic nature, right? Like I post the image, somebody is going to see this image. This is not captured, right, in any interaction. We see, this person could be influenced. This person will make something. Then somebody will see it, reshare, right? So things are constantly animated. Things are constantly moving, right? It's almost like this kind of Brownian motion, oscillating between randomness and some directed flows, right, etc., etc. I don't read like every single DH article being published, or every single article using kind of neural network, networks approach, but like there were some amazing studies which basically look at the circulation of but I mean, I think in sociology and I think in mass culture, right, there is more work which looks at circulation of ideas, circulation of news. So I think it does exist. I think it does exist.
We have one last question about
yes.
about whether data is like perspective in the 15th century, basically, for artists.
Well, I think that so what was okay. So so in early so 20 years ago, right, in the early 2000s, there was a moment when data visualization suddenly becomes popular in digital arts. So if you look at Ars Electronica or Transmediale Festival around 2003, like 30 or 40% of like top winners were doing already data visualization. In 2006, there are articles being published about artistic data visualization. So in a way, this moment already happened between, say, 97 and 2006. And this is, of course, at the end of this moment, I also start doing data visualization, right? I start looking at culture of data. So it all happened about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, right? So nothing new about it. But I don't see like much progress. That's a problem, right? So the same ideas, the same things people doing like 30 years ago, let's capture some river data and let's like use it to drive some sculpture, right? People are doing the same things. They're not any better than before. Or maybe there are some dancers, we're going to capture their movements and visualize it. Yeah, people did this in 91. And of course, when you do something for the first time, it's always more interesting, right? Because you're inventing a new mechanism. So today it's easier to do because there are instruments, there is software, there is constant tools. And because it's easier to do, there are more works. And many of them are less interesting just because you don't have to think so hard to do it, right? In a way, but the idea of data art or data design has become commonplace, right? And as often happens when things become kind of regular, when things become popular, when there's like lots of people doing it, there are a few interesting works. Most of it is not interesting, but the same thing, of course, applies to any other area of culture. It happened already, right? It happened already 20 years ago. And some with projects, like, for example, Martin Wottenberg visualization of a kind of development of Wikipedia pages done in 2003, I think remains, from my point of view, is one of the most interesting work, actually looking at cultural dynamics over time, and it was 2003. But again, maybe I don't go to lots of I don't go to festivals. I'm just doing my own thing now, focusing more on generative AI and investigations of so-called AI aesthetics, and maybe I don't see it. I think that in a way, the new game in town is generative AI. I've been lucky to live through, let's say, 4 fundamental computer media revolutions. There have been more, but for me it was 4. first, like, with development of kind of computer animation, computer graphics in the early 80s. Let's say Tron, which was the first movie using computer graphics, came out in 82. In 84, I started to work for a company which was doing titles for Tron. The web, 93. And then kind of big data, data, right? Data art, data design, data science, 2007. And now generative AI. And generative AI is, I think generative AI is bigger than perspective, right? Because for better or for worse, we humans created a kind of mirror ourselves, right? A kind of double. And as a professional artist with 50 years of experience, what I can tell you, and I can give you my arm, and if I'm wrong, you can cut my arm, because I'm sure. There has been always papers published by scientists, right, which show that in many different kind of creativity tests, right, divergent creativity, this and that. So ChatGPT is better than like 95, 97% of participants. If you look at the world of, let's say, contemporary art as represented by art biennales or museums, or popular arts as represented by deviant art, AI is better than 99.9999 artists. But I'm talking about both amateurs and people who have MFAs from Yale. Right? And of course, why wouldn't it be better, right? It was trained on kind of billions, right, of data points by smartest people in the world. Of course, AI would be better, right? So it is a and if you use more advanced tools like Midjourney, you can take any image, use it as a style reference, and it will automatically extract the kind of DNA of a style from this image and apply it to your image. So already 2 years into this evolution, this is absolutely amazing, right? This is a thing, right? This is a thing. And when you're using ChatGPT, right, and you ask it, write some text, and then you can say, how precise is this text? So some areas of culture are very kind of harder to simulate because they have more uniqueness. But if you ask ChatGPT, can you write like some kind of hypothetical description of some biennale? Can you write some hypothetical bios of artists? It comes out with absolutely perfect results, because contemporary art is one of the least creative areas of contemporary society. It's very formulaic, it's very template-driven. So, and that's a big challenge, right? That's a big challenge. So data was a big challenge or opportunity in 2003. And 20 years later, generative AI, and as I said, it's getting better, every moment. And just to finish, right, it's also, I think, interesting challenge for digital humanities, because all the stuff me and people in my lab and other people were doing and spending years of our life collecting data sets, annotating spreadsheets, etc. Now you can actually ask ChatGPT or similar tools to do it, right? People are using these tools to do kind of not only all the mechanical work in digital humanities, but you can give it a data set and say, what are the patterns? Can you visualize it? So if you look at like all the papers in digital humanities from 10 years ago, which people will spend like months and months doing it, ChatGPT can do it in a second, most of them, right? So this is a big challenge to the academy, right? ChatGPT can write most of the papers published in humanities today, except will be more meaningful, right? So what's going to happen to academy, right? Knowing the academy, what's probably going to happen is nothing good. But what should happen ideally is people said, okay, we have to write better papers, we have to write better projects, we have to do something amazing, because the work which was counting as like the top digital humanities work 5 years ago, now AI can do it like in a second, right? So this is a great challenge, right? We created the human double for ourselves. It's smarter, it's more capable, it's more encyclopedic. If you know how to use it, of course, you can also use it very badly, right? If you know how to use it, so you have to be expert. So it should push us to be better humans, to be better researchers, to ask big questions, to do the kind of things I wanted to do, for example, 15 years ago, and I couldn't, right? Because I maybe spent too much time doing all this mechanical work and collecting data, right, and annotating data. So now a big part of it can be done with AI.
I think that's
so
actually a very good place to stop. Like,
yeah,
this
sure.
message, because we should all go do some amazing work and become better humans, shouldn't we? So yeah, thanks a lot, Lev. As always, there is more food for thought after your talk than before.
Yeah, well, so as always, I take too much time, but often I find like the best comments come after. So I welcome comments, questions, criticisms. Over I am on all the social networks, and looking forward to continue conversation. And I know that I think the smartest researchers today, the most interesting new people are in Germany, from my perspective. So we'll try to come to Germany, to Berlin sometime in near future, and hope to have some nice beers
You're
and some
also
dark
welcome in
bread with some of
Potsdam.
you. Absolutely, yes,
Very close
absolutely.
to
So
Berlin.
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lev, and see you in Berlin or in Potsdam. Welcome to
Thank
Germany.
you.
Okay, then we end this for today, and thank you everybody who took part in it and asked questions. And yeah, we'll keep you posted about the next talks in the Code and Culture series.